The morning light crept over the POW camp with the soft uncertainty of a visitor who wasn't sure whether it was welcome. Thin frost clung to the barbed wire that crowned the fence line, glittering in the pale dawn. A cold breath moved across the compound, slipping through the seams of the barracks and brushing against the skin of every man standing in formation. Boots shifted on gravel, jackets rustled. The prisoners fell into their rows with the mechanical discipline of men who had long ago surrendered their ability to question routine. Karl Brenner moved slower than most, not out of disobedience, but from the caution that clung to him like a second skin. He was 24, though the past year had carved older shadows beneath his eyes. He had been a radio operator, and sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, he still felt phantom Morse tapping under his fingertips. His jacket pocket held a tiny folded scrap of paper, a small square torn from a radio logbook, the only thing he had managed to keep from the day he was captured. On it was a short sequence of code he had written for himself years before. Nothing militarily important, just a personal reminder, a meaningless line only he understood. It was the last remnant of the person he had been before war reshaped him. He touched the pocket now as if to confirm the scrap still existed. He took his usual place at the end of the second row. Not assigned, just familiar. It was close enough to hear commands, but far enough to avoid the louder prisoners who looked for amusement in boredom. A shout came from the watchtower. "Shift change yard, ready." Then came the footsteps of the guard who mattered, the one with authority over this formation. Corporal Matthew Hale. Hale walked toward them with a clipboard tucked under one arm, hands bare despite the cold. He was not like the other guards. No impatience, no loud barking, no attempts to dominate with force. He moved with quiet control, the way a good teacher might enter a restless classroom. Karl straightened. Hale reached the first row. Hands up, open palms, keep them there. The command rippled through the yard arms, rising in practiced unison. Karl raised his, but a half beat late. He glanced sideways, without meaning to, checking that he had read the instruction correctly. His palms angled wrong at first. He adjusted them, fighting the tremor already teasing his wrists. The cold bit into his skin. The wind slid over the wire above, turning it into a faint, metallic song. Hale walked the line, inspecting each man with calm precision. As he neared Karl's breath tightened. He tried to hold his posture steady, but nerves whispered through his muscles. The memory of yesterday's small mistakes still lived fresh in his body. Hale paused in front of him. Karl felt the gaze, the weight of silence. Hale looked at the uneven angle of his wrists, then at the slight tension in his shoulders. For a moment Karl feared correction, worse attention. But Hale only nodded once and moved on. Karl let out a breath he had not realized he'd been holding. Then the line shifted forward a few inches. Karl stepped with them, and in doing so, the folded slip of paper in his jacket pocket slid upward precariously. He didn't notice. Not yet. The inspection resumed. The cold deepened in Karl's arms, settling into his bones. He adjusted his stance subtly, trying not to tremble. Then it came. A soft, sharp snicker behind him. Quick, cruel, familiar. Karl's stiffened eyes fixed straight ahead. Another man, 2 spots back, raised his own hands in a mocking imitation. Palms, exaggerated elbows flared wide. "That's the wrong way," German someone muttered. Quiet enough to hide, loud enough to sting. Karl swallowed. His hands shook harder. He forced them still. Another imitation. Another laugh. A jitter of cruelty spreading like cracks in thin ice. Karl felt heat gather behind his ears. He didn't move. Couldn't. He focused instead on breathing, on keeping his posture on, not giving the mockers anything more. Then everything shifted. The gravel behind him crunched. Slowly, deliberately. Karl's pulse jumped. Hale had turned. Not halfway, not casually. He turned fully, boots pivoting, shoulders following, gaze locking onto the source of the laughter. The yard fell utterly silent. Karl didn't dare look. But he felt the atmosphere collapse into brittle stillness, the kind that descends in a classroom when the teacher has finally had enough. Then Hale took a step. Heavy. Controlled. Then another. The men who had been laughing straightened abruptly, their smirks evaporated. Someone swallowed too loudly. Hale approached the gap the mockers had created, but just as he passed Karl, something happened. The scrap of paper Carl kept his only keepsake slid out of his pocket and drifted toward the ground. Carl's breath seized. Instinct made him jerk one hand downward. A mistake, braking pose. But before the scrap could land in the dirt, a gloved hand caught it. Hale's. Carl froze, chest hollowing with dread. He expected the guard to unfold it, inspect it, confiscate it, even punish him for breaking posture. Hale glanced at the tiny paper, turned it over, saw it was nothing more than an old code fragment, not dangerous, not military. Quietly, so quietly, Carl almost didn't hear Hale said, "You dropped this." And he slipped it back into Carl's jacket pocket. No reprimand, no confiscation, no attention drawn. Carl could barely breathe. Then Hale continued past him toward the mockers, toward the growing tightness in the air that was about to snap. But as he passed Carl felt something new settle into him. A thread of humanity, a recognition, a hint that the guard saw him as more than a uniformed enemy. Hale took one more step and the yard braced for what would come next. Carl kept his hands up, trembling slightly, heart pounding. He didn't yet know that this morning would turn into the pivot point of his entire captivity. He didn't know Hale was about to step into the gap behind him. He didn't know what that would mean. He only knew the cold, the silence, and the sound of Hale's boots shifting the gravel. The moment before everything changed. The yard felt suspended, caught between breath and stillness, as Hale passed Carl and continued toward the cluster of men who had pulled back to laugh at him. The prisoners instinctively straightened, each one suddenly aware of the fragile tension that had spread across the formation. Even the cold seemed to pause, settling into an eerie quiet. Carl held the inspection posture, palms up, elbows down, but the tremor in his wrists betrayed the strain. His eyes locked ahead, fixed on a rusted knot of wire on the fence line. He felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him, pressing into his chest with invisible force. He didn't know what Hale planned to do. He only knew the guard had caught his scrap of paper, his only token of a life before the war, and returned it without a word, without punishment, without confiscation. It made the silence heavier. Behind Carl, one of the mockers, an older man with a voice like gravel, shifted his weight, preparing some retort he wouldn't dare speak aloud now. The laughter died the moment Hale turned, but the spirit of it still hung in the air like the sour echo of a bad joke. Another prisoner younger kept darting nervous glances toward Hale as though trying to gauge just how much trouble they were in. Carl felt their unease creeping up the line, then soft crunch of gravel. Hale took a final step toward the offenders, but he wasn't alone. Private Lewis, a younger American guard on rotation, followed several paces behind. Lewis was barely 19, new to the camp, still learning how to read the rhythms of the men around him. He watched Hale with careful attention, eyebrows faintly lifted. Not curious, concerned. He had seen the mocking, too. He had seen the slight quiver in Carl's hands. He understood something was unfolding that wasn't just routine. Lewis stayed back like a quiet witness. Hale stopped at the exact center of the gap, the space where the mockers had leaned back, leaving Carl exposed. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He simply looked at them. That was enough. The older mocker's jaw twitched. The younger one swallowed. A third man, the one who had exaggerated Carl's arm angle, slowly pulled his elbows in as if trying to erase evidence of what he'd done. Hale's voice finally came, low, calm, deadly precise. That's enough. No anger, no theatrics, just a boundary line drawn in cold air. Then just as the prisoners tensed, knock it off. The words landed like small stones in a quiet lake. Not loud, not harsh, but final. The mockers stiffened. Their eyes dropped. One man's breath hitched loud in the silence. Carl felt the shift ripple behind him. The laughter that had stung him like a series of small cuts seemed to dissolve all at once, erased by Hale's quiet authority. But Hale wasn't finished. He stepped forward again, straight into the gap, closing the space the mockers had created. His boots crunched into the gravel, anchoring him between Carl and the offenders. Carl felt the guard's presence like a shield settling into place. Not metaphorical, literal, embodied. Private Lewis watched from where he stood, absorbing every detail. Later he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, not because it was dramatic, but because of how undramatic it was. How a single quiet action had outweighed cruelty without using force. Hale positioned himself solidly. His shadow overlapped Carl's boots. Carl's throat tightened. Then Hale did something unexpected. He moved one step closer to Carl's right side, close enough that Carl could see the outline of his shoulder in the corner of his vision. The silence deepened. Carl's palms trembled. The cold bit into the exposed skin of his wrists. He fought the urge to correct his posture again, terrified of being noticed, terrified of appearing wrong. His mind looped through the mockery, replaying each snicker like an echo that wouldn't fade. Then Hale lifted his hand, not to discipline, not to warn, to teach. With a slow, patient motion, he demonstrated the correct angle, wrists level, elbows down, palms open. His voice came softly, like this. Carl swallowed. His breath caught. He adjusted, following the gentle line of Hale's gesture. "That's it," Hale murmured. "Hold it there." The prisoners behind them watched, chastened. The quiet scold of Hale's demeanor was more effective than any punishment could have been. Even Lewis felt the meaning of the moment press into him. Here was a guard showing a POW how to hold his hands correctly, not as domination, but as guidance, as respect, as recognition of dignity. Carl steadied himself, the posture now familiar, no longer trembling. The cold still hurt, but his breathing eased. He found a strange sense of anchor in Hale's presence, as though the guard's nearness grounded him back into his own body. Seconds passed. A long, heavy quiet wrapped the yard. Then the command to move forward rippled down the rows. Carl held his posture a second longer without being asked, until Hale gave him a small, nearly invisible nod. Only then did he lower his hands. His muscles screamed in relief. Blood returned to his fingers. The line stepped forward. And Hale stepped with them, remaining half a pace behind Carl, exactly where he could maintain the protective position without drawing attention. Carl felt every footfall of the guard behind him, not oppressive, not controlling, just steady. Lewis walked along the side perimeter, glancing between the two men with a quiet sense of understanding. The moment felt weighty, as though he'd just witnessed something far more important than a correction of posture. They moved toward the barracks path. The cold rose in little waves from the gravel. Boots scraped softly. The sun had climbed enough to paint faint gold on the edges of the camp's fencing. Behind Carl, the mockers said nothing. No chuckles, no whispers, only silence. A silence that understood a line had been drawn. Carl didn't dare turn around. He didn't want to see their faces, not out of fear, but because something inside him had shifted and he wasn't ready to confront what that meant. But he noticed something else. His pace felt steadier, his breath smoother, his shoulders less hunched. Hale walked beside him quietly, the steady rhythm of his boots a grounding beat. And Lewis, still watching, walked his own path along the perimeter, absorbing the truth that war could twist men into cruelty, but it could also allow moments of decency to bloom in the coldest places. As they neared the barracks, Carl finally dared to release a slow breath. His arms ached, but the humiliation no longer consumed him. Something else had taken root, not gratitude, not relief, trust. Tiny, fragile, but real. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The corridor between the barracks felt narrower than usual as Carl walked with the line toward their midday assignments. The cold had begun to loosen its grip on the yard, giving way to a faint warmth that glowed along the roof edges. Still, the tension in Carl's chest lingered, sitting behind his ribs like a knot he couldn't quite loosen. He walked with controlled steps, careful not to fall out of line, but acutely aware of the steady presence behind him, Corporal Hale maintaining the exact half-pace position he'd held after stepping into the gap. Carl didn't understand what it meant. Guards usually corrected from a distance. They rarely offered guidance. They never shielded a prisoner, especially not from other prisoners. Yet Hale's quiet intervention replayed through Carl's mind the soft, like this, the correction of his posture, the way his shadow had overlapped Carl's boots when he stepped between him and the mockers. And above all, the moment he'd caught the folded scrap of paper before it hit the dirt. Carl's fingers brushed the inside of his jacket pocket now. The tiny square of radio logbook rested securely inside edges, worn ink slightly smudged. It was meaningless to anyone but him, just a set of numbers and letters he'd written years ago as a training exercise. But it was the one thing he'd kept through capture, transport, and the slow grind of captivity. It reminded him he'd once had a life built around signals and code, not cold mornings, and scrutiny. The fact that Hale had given it back without a word, without confiscation, felt larger than the object itself. It felt like Hale had seen something human in him. "Move it," a guard at the front called. The line progressed again. Boots followed boots. Sunlight cut between the barracks in long stripes, warming the dust in the air. Private Lewis walked the perimeter, keeping pace with Hale. Carl noticed the young guard's eyes flick repeatedly between him and Hale, not suspicious but observant. Lewis had witnessed everything that morning. He understood instinctively that something had shifted. Workers were assigned to tasks: ditch clearing wood, splitting ration, unloading. The smell of diesel drifted from a truck near the fence, mixing with dust and cold. Carl braced for whatever was coming, hoping silently he wouldn't be assigned to anything heavy. His arms still felt like wires pulled too tight. "Brenner workshop detail again," the guard called. Relief washed through him. He stepped aside with the small group, heading toward the workshop near the western edge of the camp, an old wooden building with patched windows and a sagging roof. Inside it held tools, broken crates, and whatever small repairs the camp's overworked supply chain demanded. Carl entered behind the others. The workshop was warmer than the yard, lit by thin beams of light leaking through cracked boards. Dust floated visibly in the air, moving like small drifting ghosts. A workbench along the wall held scattered metal brackets, hinges, and screws. It smelled faintly of sawdust and grease. Carl settled at his usual station, a small table near the center. Sorting brackets was mindless, repetitive work, but it calmed him. It let his mind drift, let the tension ease out of his shoulders. He had barely begun when a soft thump landed beside his foot. A bracket had slipped from his grip. He bent down to pick it up, only to notice something else on the floor, a faint smudge of dirt from where his token had almost fallen earlier. His heart pinched again at the memory. As he rose, he glanced toward the door, half expecting Hale to appear again, but Hale didn't come. Not yet. Instead, Private Lewis walked by the workshop windows, his silhouette briefly framed by sunlight. Carl watched him pause, glance inside, register that Carl was present, and then continue. A subtle, silent confirmation that the young guard was keeping an eye on things, not out of suspicion, but awareness. Carl returned to his task hands, moving slower than usual. The brackets clinked softly, each sound punctuated by the distant hum of generators and the faint metallic groan of the fence under wind. Minutes passed, then the workshop door creaked open. Carl felt his throat tighten. Hale stepped inside. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't call attention. He simply walked a slow circuit through the workshop, checking tools, glancing at the repair lists, scribbling a note or two on his clipboard. His presence was quiet, measured, but powerful. Carl focused on the brackets. He didn't want to seem nervous. He succeeded almost. Hale paused near a stack of wooden crates. "You dropped something earlier," he said suddenly without looking up. Carl's breath froze. His fingers tightened around a bracket. Hale continued, voice low, directed at Carl, but too soft for most others to hear. "That paper. I figured it meant something." Carl swallowed hard. The room felt too warm now, too exposed. "It's nothing," he whispered. Hale turned his head slightly. "Nothing doesn't make a man break posture to catch it." Carl closed his eyes for a moment. He had no words. Hale stepped closer, still maintaining a respectful distance. He nodded toward Carl's pocket. "Don't worry, it's yours to keep." Carl looked up, startled. Most guards would have taken it. Most would have punished him. Most wouldn't have cared what it meant. But Hale wasn't most guards. Before Carl could respond, Hale looked toward the window. "Your hands seem steadier now." Only then did Carl notice his fingers weren't shaking. The brackets no longer slipped. Even his breathing felt smoother. He nodded once. "Yes, Corporal." Hale accepted the answer with a brief nod. He started toward the door, then paused again. "You did nothing wrong this morning." Carl's eyes widened slightly. "The way you raised your hands," Hale clarified. "You were slow, not defiant. There's a difference." Carl stared at the workbench, fighting the sudden sting of emotion. "Thank you," he said softly. Hale didn't smile, but his expression softened. "You're steady," he said. "You just need to remember that." He left the workshop quietly. The door shut behind him with a soft click. Carl stood frozen for several seconds, unable to process the weight of what had just happened. The words, The tone, the acknowledgement that he wasn't a problem, that his hesitation wasn't defiance, it all pierced deeper than he expected. He touched the folded paper in his pocket. For the first time in months, its meaning changed. It wasn't just a remnant of who he used to be. It was now proof, faint, fragile proof, that someone saw him as a human being, not a uniform. Private Lewis passed the window again and paused. When he saw Carl looking, he gave a quick nod, small, uncertain, but in its own way respectful. Carl returned the nod. He didn't know that Lewis would later tell someone, another guard, maybe even his own family. "I saw something that day." My corporal stood up for a man everyone else ignored, but for now, Carl simply went back to sorting the brackets. Except his hands no longer felt like trembling instruments. They felt like his. The afternoon sun slanted low across the camp, turning the gravel paths gold and casting long, quiet shadows between the barracks. It was the kind of light that softened edges, the kind of warmth that made even a place built for confinement feel, if only for a few minutes less, like a cage. Carl stepped out of the workshop with the others blinking against the brightness. His arms ached from the long shift, but it was a dull, manageable ache, the kind that came from work, not humiliation. He exhaled slowly. The day felt different, better. Not because captivity was easier, not because the war was forgotten, but because one ordinary morning had shifted the ground beneath his feet. A guard had stepped into a gap meant to isolate him. A small scrap of paper had been returned instead of torn away. A quiet moment of dignity had replaced a memory of shame, and Carl carried that with him now like a fragile ember of something long absent. Hope, maybe. He joined the line forming for the evening yard march. The prisoners arranged themselves with practiced discipline, though a faint tension rippled among the men who had mocked him earlier. They seemed uncertain where to stand, how to act, as if the morning had scrambled their instincts. Carl kept his gaze forward. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want an apology. He only wanted to stand without being singled out. The command came. Hands up. Open palms. Carl lifted his arms, steady, confident this time. His elbows aligned exactly as Hale had shown him. His palms faced outward with quiet precision. Around him, the line followed with a rustling chorus of sleeves and shifting boots. Hale approached from the far-end clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes scanning the line with the same quiet, patient authority he carried each morning. But Carl saw something different in him now. Not favoritism, not softness, just awareness. As Hale neared, Carl raised his chin slightly, not defiant, just present. The guard stopped in front of him. A pause. Hale studied the angle of Carl's wrists, the position of his elbows, the steadiness in his shoulders. Then he gave a single nod. Good. One word, quiet, solid, enough to ease the last knots of tension in Carl's spine. Behind Carl, the mockers stood still, eyes forward, bodies rigid. None dared whisper. Their earlier bravado had dissolved entirely, replaced by a strained silence. The inspection continued until the final man was checked. Then came the command, lower hands. Arms dropped in unison. A wave of relief rippled through the line. Hale moved to dismiss the formation, but stopped. He turned not to the entire row, but toward the cluster of men who had mocked Carl that morning. Carl sensed the shift, felt the air behind him tighten. Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He simply said, "We're done with that." 4 words, soft, level, unmistakable. The mocker's shoulders stiffened. One man swallowed audibly. Another lowered his gaze. A boundary had been drawn, not with punishment, but with clarity, and it held. Hale stepped away from them and positioned himself slightly ahead of Carl, angled just enough to signal that the conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Private Lewis stood a few paces away, watching, absorbing every detail. His young face carried a blend of respect and quiet astonishment. He had seen guards command before. He had seen discipline, but he had rarely seen a guard protect dignity so deliberately. Carl noticed Lewis watching. Their eyes met for a brief second, just long enough for Carl to see something in the young guard's expression. Recognition. Understanding. Witness. Lewis looked away quickly, returning to his post, but the connection lingered. The line moved forward, heading toward the narrow path by the barracks. Carl followed with measured steps, his boots crunching softly over gravel warmed by late sunlight. The air felt clearer now. The cold had softened into a gentle breeze that tugged lightly at the sleeves of the prisoners' jackets. Hale walked nearby, not hovering, not guarding him individually, but remaining within the natural orbit of the formation. Still present, still steady. They reached the corner of the yard where the fence formed a sharp angle and the path widened. The evening tasks began to disperse the rows. Some prisoners headed toward meal distribution, others toward cleaning duty. Carl stepped aside, waiting for his assignment. Hale approached him not directly, but with a purposeful, unhurried stride. Carl straightened instinctively. Hale reached into his jacket pocket. Carl froze. For a moment, just a moment, he feared Hale had reconsidered the decision to let him keep the scrap of paper. But what Hale pulled out was not the scrap itself. It was something Carl had not seen in months, a field notebook's cover worn, but intact. And inside it, protected from damage, was the folded scrap of paper Carl had nearly lost. Hale had flattened it, smoothed the creases, tucked it safely between the layers of the makeshift cover. It had been repaired, preserved. Hale held it out. "This is yours," he said quietly. "Properly this time." Carl's breath caught. He reached out slowly, hands trembling not from cold now but from something deeper. He took the small bundle carefully, as though it might crumble at his touch. "Thank you," he whispered. Hale nodded once. "Keep it where it won't fall again." Carl blinked hard, swallowing against the sudden tightness in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything. He certainly hadn't expected a guard to return an object repaired, protected, honored in a way that felt respectful. Something in him shifted. Something old and wary cracked open. He needed to offer something in return. But he had nothing. POWs owned almost nothing. A scraping of soap, a tin cup, a threadbare jacket they weren't allowed to remove. He looked down, except there was one thing. A small metal button engraved with the camp code sewn onto his sleeve. Every POW had one. Most resented them, most ignored them. But for Carl, this one, slightly dented edges worn, had been with him since the day he'd been processed into the camp. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't beautiful. But it was his. And it was the only thing he could give. Carl took a breath. "Corporal," he said softly. Hale turned his head slightly. Yes, Carl hesitated, then raised his hand to the button. His fingers slid under the stitching. He tugged gently until the threads gave way and the button came free. He held it out. "For you," he said. Hale looked at the button. A small dented thing, meaningless to anyone else. But he understood what offering it meant. He didn't reach for it immediately. Not out of refusal, but out of respect. "You don't have to give me that," Hale said quietly. "I know," Carl replied. "But I want to." A pause. Long. Waited. Hale reached out and accepted the button. His fingers closed around it gently as though accepting a fragile truth. Private Lewis, standing nearby, witnessed the entire exchange. His eyes widened just a fraction, recognizing the moment for what it was. Not a transaction. Not favoritism. Not sentimentality. A transfer. A bridging of something war had broken, a quiet act of reconciliation. Lewis would later say he'd never seen anything like it. Hale slipped the button into his jacket pocket, not hidden, but placed with intention. "Thank you, Carl," he said. It was the first time he had spoken Carl's name aloud. Carl nearly collapsed under the weight of it, not physically but emotionally. The simple humanity of being addressed by name after months of being called German prisoner or number struck deeper than any gesture could. The sounds of the camp carried on around them. A metal gate clanged. A guard shouted instructions. Boots shuffled on gravel. But in the small pocket of quiet between Carl and Hale, something irrevocable had shifted. War was still outside. Captivity was still real. But this moment, this single fragile moment, belonged to neither. Hale broke the silence first. "You're dismissed for evening line," he said, voice returning to its steady professional tone. Carl nodded. "Yes, Corporal." He stepped back toward the path but paused, turning slightly. Hale did not move away. Lewis watched, silent, respectful. Carl raised the repaired scrap of paper slightly, just enough to show he understood what it meant. Hale gave a faint nod. Carl walked on. His hands hung steady at his sides, now no tremor, no tightness. The warmth of the late sun touched his sleeves, brushing the fabric with gold. Behind him, Hale stood still for a long moment, thumb brushing the dented POW button in his pocket, before turning back toward his post. Across the yard, Carl felt a certainty settle over him. They had mocked his wrong-raised hands, but his American guard had stepped in, shielded him, guided him, and had stayed long enough that no one dared mock him again. Not out of fear, but out of witness. Because someone had seen him, and someone had stood beside him, not as enemies, but as men.